In the heart of a close-knit village, beloved schoolteacher Marisol is accused of stealing gold meant for orphaned children, shattering her reputation and leaving her isolated. Unbeknownst to the villagers, she's secretly sacrificing everything to care for her ailing sister and nephew. As the tension escalates, a shocking confession exposes everything, but not before Marisol's darkest secrets come to light. Can forgiveness mend the wounds of betrayal? And when trust is broken, can it ever truly be restored? The morning bell echoed through the quiet streets of the village, a sound as familiar as the rustling leaves of the sycamores lining the cobblestone paths. Marisol tightened her shawl against the crisp air, her fingers trembling slightly from both the chill and the weight of the brass key in her hand. It wasn't just any key. It was the vault key for St. Clara's parish, a trusted symbol of her duty as the schoolteacher and custodian of the town's fragile faith. Yet, trust could be as fleeting as the autumn sun, and she felt its warmth slipping away with every step she took. The lockbox had vanished overnight. By the time Marisol reached the church, the villagers were already gathered, their faces painted with suspicion. Father Ignacio, his usually gentle eyes clouded with worry, gestured for silence. "The funds for the orphanage," he said, his voice steady but strained, "are missing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd like an incoming tide. The gold coins in that box were meant to buy food and blankets for the winter, a lifeline for the children left with nothing. Marisol's heart pounded. She had turned the key herself the day before, ensuring the lock was secure. But now, the air was heavy with questions, their edges sharp and accusatory. "How could this happen?" asked Mrs. Cardoza, the baker, her flour-dusted hands clutching her apron. "Who had access to the vault?" Marisol opened her mouth to speak, but Mr. Alvarez, the village carpenter, beat her to it. "Only Marisol," he said, his tone laced with doubt. "She's the keeper of the key." The words hung in the air like smoke. Marisol froze, every eye turning toward her. The trust she had built over years as the village's teacher, mentor, and confidant began to crack under their gazes. No one spoke outright, but the implication was clear. "I would never," Marisol started, her voice trembling. "I would never take what belongs to the children." "Then where is the box?" demanded Mr. Alvarez. Father Ignacio raised a hand to calm the growing unrest. "Let us not jump to conclusions," he said, though even his voice carried an edge of doubt. "We will investigate. Until then, let us pray for the truth to reveal itself." As the crowd dispersed reluctantly, Marisol felt the weight of judgment settle on her shoulders. The children from her class tugged at their mother's skirts, their curious eyes darting between her and the adults. Even their trust felt fragile now. By the time she returned home, Marisol was trembling. Her modest cottage sat at the edge of the village, where the fields stretched into the horizon. Inside, her sister Beatrice lay on the bed, her face pale and drawn. The baby nestled beside her cooed softly, oblivious to the storm brewing beyond their walls. "They know, don't they?" Beatrice's voice was weak but certain. Marisol sank into the chair beside her sister. "They think I stole it." Beatrice's hand reached out, grasping Marisol's with what little strength she had. "You've done nothing wrong." Marisol couldn't meet her sister's eyes. The truth was far more complicated. She had pawned her mother's silver comb set 2 weeks ago to pay for Beatrice's medicine. The trips to the pawn shop, while necessary, had drawn whispers among the villagers. To them, they were breadcrumbs, leading to guilt. "I'll find a way to fix this," Marisol whispered, though her resolve felt as brittle as the dried leaves outside. "For you, for him." Her eyes flicked to the baby, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling as he slept. That night, as the village settled into uneasy slumber, Marisol lit a single candle and spread out the pawn shop receipts on the table. The dates stared back at her like silent witnesses. She hadn't stolen the lockbox, but explaining her trips to the pawn shop without revealing her sister's plight would only fuel the fire. Her secret was both her shield and her cage. A knock at the door startled her. She hurriedly swept the papers into a drawer and opened it to find Father Ignacio standing there, his face grave. "Marisol," he began, stepping inside. "There are whispers. You must tell me if you've seen anything unusual." Marisol hesitated. She trusted the priest, but trust was a fragile thing. "I haven't," she said carefully. "I locked the vault myself." His eyes searched hers for a long moment. "The villagers are restless. I fear this will not be easily resolved." As he left, Marisol's gaze fell on the key hanging by the door. It gleamed faintly in the candlelight, a cruel reminder of her burden. In the silence, the baby stirred, his soft cry breaking through the heavy quiet. Marisol hurried to him, cradling him in her arms. "Shh," she murmured. "I'll keep you safe, I promise." But as the night wore on, that promise felt as fragile as the key she held so tightly, its weight heavier than ever. The days that followed unfolded like a slow-moving storm. The whispers that had begun in the church now echoed in every corner of the village, at the baker's shop, at the well, and even at the schoolhouse. Marisol's name was never far from the murmured gossip. "Have you seen how thin Beatrice has gotten?" Mrs. Ortega, the seamstress, whispered to a cluster of women near the market. "Maybe Marisol has been using the church's funds to take care of her. They say she's been to the pawn shop more than once," added another voice, hushed but sharp. "What else could she be selling, if not the stolen gold?" Inside her classroom, Marisol kept her head high and her voice steady as she guided her students through their lessons. But the children, perceptive in ways adults often underestimated, sensed the shift. They whispered to each other in cautious tones and avoided her gaze when she looked their way. It wasn't until recess that one of the older boys, Santiago, approached her hesitantly. His dark eyes were full of concern. "Miss Marisol," he began, twisting the hem of his shirt, "are you leaving?" Marisol crouched down to his level, forcing a gentle smile. "Why would you think that, Santiago?" He hesitated, glancing at the group of children huddled near the swings. "My mama said, she said people don't want you here anymore." Her heart clenched, but she placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes grown-ups say things when they're upset, but don't you worry. I'm not going anywhere." Santiago nodded, though his expression remained troubled. As he ran back to his friends, Marisol watched him go, the lump in her throat growing heavier. The trust she had worked so hard to earn was unraveling, thread by thread. At home, Beatrice's condition had worsened. Her fever spiked during the nights, leaving her weak and barely able to eat during the day. The baby, oblivious to his mother's struggles, grew fussier, his cries piercing the already tense air of the cottage. Marisol stretched her resources as far as they would go, but the shelves were growing emptier with each passing day. The few coins she had left wouldn't be enough to cover more medicine, and the thought of visiting the pawn shop again filled her with dread. The last time she had gone, the shopkeeper's eyes had lingered on her too long, his silence heavier than words. "Maybe it's time to tell them the truth," Beatrice said one evening, her voice a faint whisper. Marisol looked up from the soup she was stirring, her jaw tightening. "And then what? They'll pity us? Or worse, they'll accuse you of being part of it." "They're already accusing you," Beatrice countered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "At least if they knew—" "No." Marisol's voice was firm, though the weight of her defiance pressed down on her. "They don't deserve to know. This is our burden, not theirs." The baby began to cry again, and Marisol went to him, her touch gentle, but her mind racing. How long could she keep this up? How long before the villagers' suspicion turned into something more dangerous? That night, as Marisol lay awake in the narrow bed she shared with her nephew, a new sound broke the stillness. It was faint at first, a scraping noise like metal against wood. Her heart leapt, and she sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again, this time louder, closer. Someone was outside. She slipped out of bed and moved quietly to the door, grabbing the kitchen knife on the way. The scraping stopped, replaced by the sound of hurried footsteps retreating into the night. When she flung open the door, the only evidence of the intruder was a single slip of paper pinned to the doorframe. In the flickering light of the candle, she read the words scrawled in angry, uneven handwriting. "Confess before it's too late." Her breath caught, and she crumpled the paper in her fist. Her first instinct was to tear it to shreds, but she forced herself to stop. This wasn't just an act of anger. It was a warning. Someone had come to her home, crossed the threshold of her sanctuary. The safety of her family was no longer guaranteed. The next morning, Marisol stood at the church steps, waiting for Father Ignacio. He appeared shortly after dawn, his robes swaying gently in the breeze. "Father?" she called, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. He turned to her, his expression softening. "Marisol, what brings you here so early?" She hesitated, then held out the crumpled note. "Someone left this at my door." He took the paper and read it, his brow furrowing deeply. "This is troubling," he said, glancing around as if expecting the culprit to reveal themselves. "Do you have any idea who might have written this?" "No," she replied, though the faces of half the village flashed through her mind. "But I can't ignore it." Father Ignacio nodded gravely. "Leave this with me. I'll speak to the congregation and remind them to keep their faith in justice." Marisol wanted to believe him, but the look in his eyes betrayed his own uncertainty. Justice, it seemed, was a luxury the village could no longer afford. Later that day, as Marisol walked home from the market, she spotted Mr. Alvarez speaking with a man she didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and gaunt, with a weathered face and a shifty gaze. He carried a small satchel, and though their conversation seemed casual, the way Mr. Alvarez glanced around made Marisol uneasy. When they parted ways, she noticed Mr. Alvarez slipping something into his pocket. Her pulse quickened. Could he be involved? Or was her mind now twisted by the constant pressure of suspicion? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. Paranoia would only make things worse. But as she continued home, the image of Mr. Alvarez's secretive exchange lingered, planting the first seed of doubt that her innocence might not be the only truth hiding in the shadow. The following week, the tension in the village escalated. Suspicion, like a wildfire, spread from person to person, scorching trust and leaving behind ashes of doubt. People began locking their doors earlier in the evening, and whispers of betrayal seeped into even the most mundane conversations. Marisol became a walking shadow, her presence igniting side glances and stifled murmurs. She felt the weight of every gaze as she carried the sack of flour from the market back to her cottage. Her steps quickened when she passed a group of villagers clustered near the well, their voices low but unmistakably aimed at her. "It's a shame," one woman said, "to think we trusted her with our children. And the vault," another added. "Too much trust, if you ask me." Marisol didn't look back, but the sting of their words cut deep. Her grip tightened on the sack until her knuckles turned white. Each day felt like a battle to hold herself together, her resolve a fragile dam against a flood of despair. At home, Beatrice noticed the strain etched into her sister's face. "You can't keep carrying this alone, Marisol," she said softly, cradling her baby in her arms. "It's tearing you apart." "I don't have a choice," Marisol replied, placing the flour on the counter. "If they find out about you, they'll only twist it into another reason to hate me." Beatrice sighed, her guilt as heavy as the fever that left her bedridden. "Maybe I should leave. Go somewhere else. At least then—" "No," Marisol interrupted sharply, her voice cracking. "You're not going anywhere. You and Mateo are my family, and I will protect you no matter what." The baby, as if sensing the tension, let out a soft wail. Marisol scooped him up and held him close, his tiny warmth a reminder of the stakes she couldn't afford to lose. Later that evening, Marisol sat by the window, staring out at the darkened village. Her mind replayed the moment she had seen Mr. Alvarez speaking with the stranger. The memory nagged at her, a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit but refused to be ignored. She decided to act. The next morning, Marisol made her way to the carpenter's workshop. It was early enough that the streets were mostly empty, the air still cool and damp with morning dew. She found Mr. Alvarez sanding a wooden bench, his sleeves rolled up and his brow furrowed in concentration. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Alvarez looked up, surprised. "Marisol?" he greeted, though his tone lacked warmth. "What brings you here? I need to ask you something," she said, stepping closer. "Who was the man you were speaking with near the market a few days ago?" He stiffened, his hands pausing mid-motion. "Why do you ask?" "I've seen the way people look at me," she said, meeting his gaze. "I know what they're thinking, but I also know that there's more to this than they're saying." If you know something, Mr. Alvarez, now is the time to tell the truth. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he set down his tools and leaned against the bench. The man's name is Tomas, he admitted reluctantly. He's an appraiser. I hired him to look at something for me. What kind of something? Marisol pressed. A piece of jewelry, he said, his tone defensive. It's nothing to do with the church or the lockbox. Marisol studied him, searching for any hint of deceit. Why so secretive, then? He hesitated, then sighed. Because people talk, Marisol. You, of all people, should understand that. His words struck a chord, and Marisol felt a pang of doubt. Was he just another victim of the village's growing paranoia? Or was he hiding something more? As the days passed, the pressure on Marisol only grew. The children at school became restless, their whispers more frequent, and their gazes less innocent. One morning, she found a crude drawing etched into her desk, a stick figure holding a large key surrounded by angry faces. Her heart sank. The innocence she had always cherished in her students was slipping away, poisoned by the distrust of their parents. She ran her fingers over the carving, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. When the day ended, she lingered in the empty classroom, her thoughts heavy. The sun cast long shadows through the windows, the golden light doing little to lift the weight of her despair. "Miss Marisol?" A small voice called out, breaking the silence. She turned to see Elena, one of her youngest students, standing hesitantly in the doorway. The girl's dark braids framed her worried face, and she clutched a folded piece of paper in her hands. "What is it, Elena?" Marisol asked gently, kneeling to meet her at eye level. Elena stepped forward, her small hands trembling as she held out the paper. "I found this on the church steps," she whispered. "I thought you should have it." Marisol unfolded the paper, her heart pounding. The message inside was brief but chilling. "You're not the only one with secrets." Her breath caught, and she clutched the note tightly. Who had left it? And what did they know? The village was suffocating her, its secrets coiling tighter around her with every passing day. That night, Marisol couldn't sleep. The notes, the whispers, the veiled accusations. They were pieces of a puzzle she couldn't solve, and now someone else seemed to know something she didn't. She rose from her bed and lit a candle, the flame flickering uncertainly in the darkness. Pulling out the receipts from the pawn shop, she spread them across the table once more. The dates aligned perfectly with Beatrice's illness, a clear testament to her innocence. But innocence wasn't enough if no one believed her. Her gaze fell on the key hanging by the door. It gleamed faintly in the candlelight, mocking her. She had been the keeper of the key, the trusted guardian of the church's most precious assets. And now that trust was gone, replaced by suspicion and fear. With a heavy heart, she extinguished the candle and returned to bed. As she lay in the dark, Mateo's soft breathing beside her, one thought repeated in her mind: secrets have a way of coming to light, and when they did, the truth would change everything. The chill of early morning wrapped around the village like a cold whisper, but Marisol barely noticed as she hurried along the cobblestone path. The church loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the pale dawn sky. Inside, Father Ignacio would be preparing for the morning prayers, and Marisol needed answers. Answers she wasn't sure he could give, but that she desperately hoped he held. When she reached the heavy oak doors, she hesitated. The weight of the note Elena had given her pressed against her chest. "You're not the only one with secrets." The words haunted her, mingling with the gnawing sense that she had missed something crucial, something hiding in plain sight. She pushed the door open. The air inside was cool and filled with the faint scent of incense. Father Ignacio was lighting the candles along the altar, his movements slow and deliberate. "Father," she called softly, her voice echoing in the stillness. He turned, his face lighting up with surprise. "Marisol, you're here early." "I need to speak with you," she said, stepping closer. "It's important." Father Ignacio nodded and gestured to the pews. They sat together in the front row, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that danced on the stone walls. "I've received another note," Marisol began, pulling the crumpled paper from her pocket. She handed it to him, watching as his brow furrowed deeply while he read it. "This," he trailed off, his fingers tightening around the paper. "This is troubling." Troubling, she repeated, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Father, I'm being harassed in my own home. People are accusing me of things I didn't do, and now someone's leaving cryptic threats. If you know something, anything, please, tell me. Father Ignacio sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. Marisol, I believe you. I've always believed you. But you must understand, the people in this village are frightened. When fear takes root, it grows into something dangerous. It clouds judgment. That doesn't answer my question, Marisol said, her voice rising slightly. Who else has access to the vault? Who else could have taken the money? Father Ignacio hesitated. No one but you and me have keys. And you trust me, so... She paused, her breath catching. Are you saying someone made a copy? I don't know, he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. But it's possible. The vault's lock is old and keys can be forged. I've tried to keep the peace, Marisol, but this situation is unraveling faster than I can mend it. Marisol stared at him, the realization settling over her like a cold wave. Someone had deliberately set her up, and whoever it was had succeeded in turning the entire village against her. Later that day, as Marisol walked home, she felt the eyes of the villagers on her. The market square was bustling with activity, but the air was thick with tension. She passed Mr. Alvarez's workshop again, her steps slowing as she saw him speaking with the same gaunt stranger. This time, they exchanged a small package, their movements quick and furtive. Her pulse quickened. She waited until the stranger left, then approached Mr. Alvarez, who stiffened at her approach. Mr. Alvarez, she called, her tone even but firm. Can we speak? Now's not a good time, Marisol, he said, avoiding her gaze. I've got work to do. This will only take a moment, she insisted, stepping closer. I need to know what's going on. Who is that man? No one you need to worry about, he replied, his voice tense. But I do worry, she countered, her frustration building. Because every time I see you with him, I can't help but wonder what you're hiding. Mr. Alvarez's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed as though he would say something, but then he shook his head. I don't owe you any explanations, he said before turning back to his work. Marisol left, her heart pounding. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. That evening, as Marisol tucked Mateo into bed, Beatrice watched her sister with a mix of gratitude and guilt. You've sacrificed so much for us, Beatrice said softly. But you can't keep fighting this battle alone. I don't have a choice, Marisol replied, brushing a stray curl from Mateo's face. I can't lose you, either of you. Beatrice reached for her hand, her grip weak but steady. What if the truth comes out, and it hurts you more than it helps? Marisol looked away. The truth, as much as she clung to it, felt like a double-edged sword. If the villagers found out about her trips to the pawn shop, about the desperate measures she had taken to keep her family alive, would they understand, or would they twist it into another reason to condemn her? She squeezed her sister's hand. I'll deal with that when the time comes. The next morning, Marisol made her way to the pawn shop. The air was heavy with the threat of rain, the sky a dull gray. She kept her head down, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. When she entered the shop, the bell above the door jingled, and the shopkeeper, a wiry man with sharp eyes, looked up from the counter. Miss Marisol, he said, his tone polite but wary. What brings you here? I need information, she said, her voice steady. About anyone else who's been here recently, anyone selling or appraising valuables. The shopkeeper hesitated. You know I can't disclose that. I'm not asking for names, she pressed. Just, have there been others? Anyone unusual? He studied her for a long moment before nodding. There's been a man, tall, thin, with a face like a hawk. He's been in a few times recently, asking about coins. Gold coins. Marisol's stomach dropped. Did he sell any? No, the shopkeeper said. But he asked about the value of a large quantity. Said he was just curious, but it felt odd. Thank you, Marisol said, her mind racing. As she left the shop, the first drops of rain began to fall. She clutched her shawl tightly and hurried home, her thoughts a whirlwind. Someone was moving the stolen gold, or trying to, and whoever it was had gone to great lengths to keep their secret hidden. But secrets couldn't stay buried forever. The storm hit that night. Rain pounded against the windows of Marisol's cottage, the wind howling as if it carried the voices of the village's collective judgment. Inside, she paced the small living room, her thoughts racing. The puzzle pieces were there: Mr. Alvarez's suspicious behavior, the mysterious man at the pawn shop, the notes. But they refused to come together. Every angle she considered felt incomplete, a shadow of the truth. Beatrice stirred on the bed, her weak voice cutting through the sound of the storm. "Marisol, sit down. You're going to drive yourself mad." "I can't," Marisol replied, her voice tight with frustration. "Every time I get close to something, it slips away. I know someone is trying to frame me, Beatrice. I just don't know why." "Maybe it's not about you," Beatrice suggested. Her words, though soft, struck Marisol like a blow. "Maybe it's about the gold. Whoever took it, they might be trying to protect themselves." Marisol stopped pacing, her sister's words igniting a spark in her mind. What if this wasn't about her at all? What if it was about desperation, about survival, just like her own actions had been? But desperation didn't excuse cruelty. It didn't justify putting a target on her back. Whoever had stolen the gold had to answer for it. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the air remained heavy with unease. Marisol arrived at the church early, her determination outweighing her exhaustion. She carried with her the receipts from the pawn shop, neatly folded and tied with string. Father Ignacio was lighting candles when she entered, and he looked up in surprise. "Marisol, you're here again. Have you learned something?" "I need to speak at Sunday Mass," she said, her voice resolute. "I need to tell the village the truth." Father Ignacio's expression darkened. "Are you sure that's wise? They may not listen." "They'll listen if I give them no choice," Marisol replied. She held up the receipts. "This is the proof of my innocence. I've sold everything I own to care for my sister and her child. I didn't steal the gold, and I need them to know." The priest hesitated, then nodded solemnly. "Very well. But be prepared, Marisol. The truth doesn't always set us free." When Sunday arrived, the church was packed. News of Marisol's planned address had spread quickly, and the villagers filled the pews, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and apprehension. Marisol stood at the front, her hands trembling as she clutched the receipts. She glanced at Father Ignacio, who gave her a reassuring nod. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "I know many of you believe I stole from the church," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've heard the whispers, seen the looks, and I know I've done little to defend myself. But today, I'm here to tell you the truth." She unfolded the receipts and held them up. "These are the records of everything I've sold. My mother's jewelry, my family's heirlooms. Every peso went to care for my sister Beatrice and her child Mateo." A murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion mingling with doubt. "Beatrice has been ill for months," Marisol continued. "Her husband abandoned her, and I couldn't stand by and watch her suffer, but I kept it a secret because I was ashamed. Ashamed that I couldn't provide for my family without losing everything we had left." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. "I didn't take the gold. I didn't betray this village or the children who need our help. Someone else did, and they've allowed you to believe it was me." The murmurs grew louder, the crowd shifting uneasily. From the corner of her eye, Marisol saw Mr. Alvarez fidgeting in his seat, his face pale. "I've given you the truth," she said, her voice rising above the noise. "Now, I ask you to search your own hearts. If you truly believe I could do such a thing, then so be it. But if you doubt my guilt even for a moment, then help me find the real thief." The room erupted into chaos. People shouted over one another, some defending Marisol, others demanding more proof. But as the noise swelled, a sudden voice cut through, sharp and panicked. "Enough!" All eyes turned to Mr. Alvarez, who had risen to his feet. His face was ashen, his hands trembling. I can't do this anymore," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I took the gold." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Marisol stared at him, shock mingling with a strange sense of relief. "It was me," Mr. Alvarez continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I was behind on my debts, and Tomas, the man you saw me with, he offered to help. He said he could sell the coins and make it look like a robbery. I didn't mean for Marisol to take the blame. I swear." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Father Ignacio stepped forward, his expression stern. "You betrayed this community, Alvarez. You let an innocent woman suffer for your crime. I'll make it right," Mr. Alvarez pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "I'll return what's left. Just, please, forgive me." The villagers turned their attention to Marisol, their faces filled with a mixture of shame and guilt. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. As the congregation dispersed, Marisol stayed behind, her legs weak, but her heart steady. Father Ignacio approached her, his face weary but kind. "You've shown remarkable strength, Marisol," he said, "and now the truth is known." "Truth doesn't erase the pain," she replied, her voice quiet. "But it's a start," the priest nodded. "It's a start indeed." The confession spread through the village like wildfire. By the evening, everyone knew the truth. Mr. Alvarez had stolen the church's gold. But while his admission cleared Marisol's name, it didn't erase the scars left behind by weeks of suspicion and isolation. The shame of the villagers was palpable, but it was too late to take back the accusations, the whispered rumors, the veiled threats. Marisol sat by the fire in her small cottage that night, staring into the flickering flame. Mateo cooed softly in his sleep, cradled in Beatrice's arm. The baby's peaceful face was a stark contrast to the storm that still brewed inside Marisol's heart. "You should feel relieved," Beatrice said gently, breaking the silence. The truth came out. Marisol shook her head. "Relief isn't what I feel. It's something else, something heavier." "Anger?" Beatrice guessed. Marisol didn't answer immediately. "Maybe, but also sadness. These people were my friends, my neighbors. They trusted me once. Now that trust is broken, and I don't know if it can ever be mended." Beatrice reached out, her hand frail but steady as it rested on Marisol's arm. "You've done more for this village than they'll ever realize. Give them time." Sometimes, healing takes longer than forgiveness. The next morning, Marisol returned to the schoolhouse. The air was crisp, the sky painted with the soft hues of dawn. As she approached, she noticed a small group of villagers waiting outside. Among them were Mrs. Ortega, the seamstress, and Santiago's mother. Marisol's steps faltered, her heart pounding. The memory of their judgment still stung, but she straightened her shoulders and continued forward. "Marisol," Mrs. Ortega began, her voice trembling. We owe you an apology." Santiago's mother stepped forward, her eyes filled with guilt. "We were wrong to doubt you. You've done so much for our children, for all of us. We let fear cloud our judgment." The others nodded, their faces solemn. Marisol looked at them, the weight of their words settling over her. Forgiveness wouldn't come easily, not for them, and not for herself. But their remorse was genuine. "I appreciate your words," she said finally. "But trust isn't rebuilt with apologies. It's earned, brick by brick." The women nodded, understanding the unspoken promise in her words. They would have to work to regain what they had lost. At church that Sunday, the mood was somber but hopeful. Mr. Alvarez stood before the congregation, his shoulders slumped as he addressed the crowd. "I've sinned against all of you," he said, his voice heavy with shame. "I stole from the parish, and in doing so, I betrayed your trust. But more than that, I let an innocent woman take the blame for my actions." His voice cracked, and he took a deep breath before continuing. "I've returned what I could. The rest is gone, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to repay it. All I ask is for your forgiveness." The congregation was silent for a long moment before Father Ignacio spoke. "Forgiveness is not given lightly, Alvarez. It is earned. You have taken the first step by confessing, but your journey is far from over." Marisol sat in the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She felt no satisfaction in his humiliation, only a deep sense of exhaustion. Justice had been served, but the cost had been high, for everyone. In the weeks that followed, life in the village slowly began to return to normal. The children returned to the schoolhouse, their whispers replaced with laughter. The villagers made small gestures to repair the damage they had done. Fresh loaves of bread left on Marisol's doorstep, offers to help with repairs around her cottage, invitations to share meals. But Marisol remained guarded. The wounds of betrayal ran deep, and while she accepted their kindness, She kept her heart protected. One afternoon, as she walked through the market, Santiago ran up to her, his face lit with excitement. "Miss Marisol, my mama said you're not mad at us anymore." Marisol knelt down, her smile gentle but bittersweet. "I was never mad at you, Santiago. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and it takes time to fix them." He nodded solemnly, then reached into his pocket and held out a small, hand-carved wooden key. "I made this for you," he said shyly, "so you can always remember you're the keeper of the key." Tears pricked Marisol's eyes as she took the gift. The key was rough and uneven, but it was perfect in its sincerity. She hugged Santiago tightly, the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart. That evening, as she sat by the fire with Beatriz and Mateo, Marisol turned the wooden key over in her hand. It was a symbol, not of her burden, but of her strength. She had weathered the storm, and though the scars remained, they were a testament to her resilience. "You're smiling," Beatriz said, her voice soft. Marisol looked up, her eyes shining. "I think I'm finally starting to heal." The sound of Mateo's laughter filled the room, a bright, joyful melody that cut through the lingering shadows. And for the first time in months, Marisol felt the faint stirrings of hope. The days turned into weeks, and Marisol began to notice subtle changes in the village. The villagers who had once avoided her now offered smiles and warm greetings. Children waved as they passed by the schoolhouse, their laughter ringing out like bells in the crisp air. The heaviness that had clouded her heart was lifting, though she still tread cautiously around their newfound kindness. Mr. Alvarez, on the other hand, had become a ghost of himself. He spent his days working tirelessly to repay what he had stolen, his eyes downcast whenever he crossed paths with Marisol. She couldn't bring herself to hate him, despite the pain he had caused. His guilt was punishment enough. One quiet morning, Marisol found herself in the church, the soft light streaming through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the stone floor. She knelt at the altar, not to pray, but to think. The village had begun to mend, but she still felt the sting of what had been lost. Trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned to see Father Ignacio approaching, his hands clasped behind his back. "You've been through much, Marisol," he said gently, his voice echoing in the quiet space. "But you've handled it with grace." She let out a soft laugh, the sound tinged with bitterness. "Grace? I've been angry, frightened, and exhausted. If that's grace, then perhaps I've misunderstood the meaning." "Grace isn't about never feeling anger or fear," he replied. "It's about what you choose to do with those feelings. You've shown resilience, compassion, and strength when it would have been easier to give up." Marisol looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden pew. "I'm tired, Father. I don't know if I can keep fighting." "You don't have to fight alone anymore," he said. "The village has seen the truth and they want to make amends. But forgiveness, both for them and for yourself, is a choice you'll have to make." His words lingered in her mind long after she left the church. Later that day, Marisol returned to the schoolhouse to prepare for her lessons. As she sorted through the children's books, she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Mrs. Ortega standing there, holding a bundle of fabric. "I made this for you," Mrs. Ortega said, her voice tentative. She unfolded the fabric to reveal a beautiful shawl, its intricate patterns woven with care. "I know it doesn't make up for what we've done, but I wanted you to have it." Marisol accepted the gift, her throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's beautiful." The older woman hesitated, then reached out to touch Marisol's hand. "We failed you, Marisol, all of us. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that community is built on second chances. Will you give us one?" Marisol looked at her, seeing not just guilt but genuine hope in her eyes. She nodded, the beginnings of forgiveness stirring in her heart. "I will try." As the seasons changed, so did the village. The tension that had once gripped the community began to ease, replaced by a renewed sense of unity. Marisol found herself drawn into their efforts to rebuild trust, not just for their sake, but for her own. She helped organize charity drives for the orphanage, taught the children new songs for the harvest festival, and even accepted invitations to join families for dinner. But the most profound change came in her relationship with Beatriz. The two sisters, once burdened by secrecy and shame, grew closer as they leaned on each other for support. Beatrice's health improved, her laughter returning to the cottage like sunlight after a long winter. Matteo, now toddling on unsteady legs, became the heart of their small family. His joy was infectious, a reminder of the innocence they had fought so hard to protect. One afternoon, Marisol was surprised to see Mr. Alvarez waiting outside the schoolhouse. He held a small wooden box in his hand, his face lined with remorse. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice quiet. "I know it won't change what I've done, but you deserve to know why." Marisol invited him inside, her heart heavy with curiosity and caution. He placed the box on her desk and opened it to reveal a collection of tarnished coins and a faded photograph of a young woman holding a child. "She was my wife," he explained, his voice breaking, "and that was my son. I lost them years ago to illness. The debts piled up after their passing and I couldn't keep up. When I saw the gold, I thought it was a way to fix everything. But all it did was ruin more lives." Marisol studied the photograph, her anger softening as she saw the pain etched into his face. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Pride," he admitted, "and fear. I didn't want to be seen as weak." She looked at him, her own heart aching with empathy. "We all make mistakes," she said, "but owning up to them takes courage. You've done that." Mr. Alvarez nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you, Marisol, for listening." As he left, Marisol felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. His confession, though painful, was another step toward healing. That evening, Marisol sat by the fire, the wooden key Santiago had given her resting in her hand. She thought of the village, of Beatrice and Matteo, of Mr. Alvarez and his lost family. The trials they had faced had left scars, but they had also revealed the strength of their resilience. "Sometimes," she whispered to herself, "it's the heaviest keys that unlock the strongest doors." And as the fire crackled softly, she felt a quiet hope settle in her heart, knowing that the hardest chapters often led to the most beautiful endings. The sun rose over the village, painting the rooftops in warm hues of gold and amber. The chill of autumn lingered in the air, but the winds carried a sense of renewal. Today was the Harvest Festival, a day meant for celebration, gratitude, and community. For the first time in months, Marisol felt a quiet anticipation as she prepared to join the festivities. Beatrice, her strength returning day by day, sat at the table feeding Matteo, who babbled happily between bites. The cottage was filled with the comforting smells of bread baking and herbs drying by the fire. "You should wear the shawl Mrs. Ortega made for you," Beatrice suggested, her voice lighter than it had been in weeks. "It's a beautiful day. Let them see you, truly see you." Marisol hesitated, her fingers brushing over the soft fabric draped on the chair. The gesture was simple, but it carried weight, a silent acknowledgement of the villagers' efforts to mend what had been broken. With a deep breath, she wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, its warmth settling over her like a hug. The festival was already in full swing when Marisol arrived at the village square. Stalls lined the cobblestone streets, offering everything from fresh produce to handmade trinkets. Children darted between the adults, their laughter filling the air as they chased one another around the maypole. As Marisol moved through the crowd, heads turned. People greeted her with smiles and nods, their warmth a stark contrast to the cold suspicion she had endured not long ago. Mrs. Ortega waved her over to a stall filled with vibrant fabrics. "I'm glad you came," she said, her eyes bright with sincerity. "The village wouldn't be the same without you." "Thank you," Marisol replied, her voice soft but steady. "It means a lot." Nearby, Santiago tugged at her sleeve, his face beaming. "Miss Marisol, come see what we made." He led her to a table covered in small wooden carvings, animals, flowers, and tiny houses, all crafted by the children in her class. At the center of the display was a carving of a key, much like the one Santiago had given her before, but larger and more intricate. "It's for you," he said proudly. "We all worked on it. To say thank you." Marisol's throat tightened as she picked up the key, its smooth surface cool against her palm. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "It's beautiful." The festival continued into the evening. the square coming alive with music and dancing. Lanterns were lit as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the crowd. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marisol allowed herself to relax. She joined in the laughter, the conversations, the shared joy that had once seemed so distant. As she stood on the edge of the square, watching the villagers dance, Father Ignacio approached. He carried a small leather-bound book, its cover worn with age. "This belonged to the parish records," he said, handing it to her. "I thought you might want to see it." Marisol opened the book to find an entry dated decades earlier. It detailed a donation made by her great-grandparents to establish the orphanage, a sum of gold coins gifted to the church in secret. "The lockbox wasn't just the parish's," Father Ignacio explained. "It was your family's legacy, entrusted to the church for safekeeping. You were the keeper of the key in more ways than one." Marisol's eyes filled with tears as she traced the faded handwriting. She had always felt a deep connection to the orphanage, but knowing her family's role in its creation filled her with a profound sense of purpose. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the book to her chest. As the festival wound down, Marisol returned home with Mateo asleep in her arms. Beatriz greeted her with a tired smile, the firelight casting soft shadows on her face. "You look happy," Beatriz said, as Marisol laid Mateo in his crib. "I think I am," Marisol replied, her voice tinged with wonder. For the first time in a long while, she sat by the fire, the wooden key and the book resting in her lap. The village had come together in ways she hadn't thought possible, their shared struggles forging a bond stronger than before. And though the scars of the past remained, they were no longer painful reminders. They were marks of growth, of resilience, of hope. "Sometimes," Marisol said, her voice quiet but steady, "we have to lose what we hold dear to understand its true value." Beatriz nodded, her eyes glistening. "And sometimes we find something even more precious along the way." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Marisol leaned back in her chair, the warmth of the flames and the weight of the wooden key grounding her in the moment. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, she was content. She had faced the storm, and she had endured. As the embers of the fire glowed faintly in the dark, Marisol whispered a silent prayer, not of despair, but of gratitude for her sister, her nephew, her village, and the chance to start anew. Thank you for joining us for HeroKind Stories. If Marisol's journey moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with friends and family. Let others know that strength and hope can shine through even the darkest moments. Subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more heartfelt tales, and leave a comment below to tell us how this story touched your heart. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear from you.